Good day. Before I proceed with the subject matter of this program, I'm afraid there's, again, some rather annoying news that I have to discuss about attempts to market certain items, including, I've noticed, books purportedly about Alexander the Great and other things, using my name and claiming that I'm in some way connected to this, and alleging that there's 70% discounts on these items. Let me repeat again. I've said this before in previous programs, but I want to say it one more time. I have no idea who is responsible for this activity. I have absolutely no connection with any of this activity at all. I consider it, frankly, criminal and fraudulent and an attempted identity theft. And I try to report these matters to the relevant authorities, but as we see, things like that seem to be happening repeatedly. All I can say is, if anybody receives information to this effect, and I understand that claims about the sale of these items are now appearing on Amazon, in other words, these things are purportedly appearing on Amazon, they have absolutely nothing to do with me. The only items, the only merchandise in whose sale I am involved is the merchandise which is being sold by the Duran through its shop, of which you can find links under this video. I have to say that all of this activity over the last couple of weeks, the repeated appearances of phony channels purporting to be connected to myself, both on YouTube and Instagram and other platforms, this appearance of this bogus shop operating on Amazon, all of this has been deeply distressing to me personally and frankly very, very frustrating indeed. It has demonstrated again the limits of activity, of policing activity in the internet age. Anyway, I hope I've made it clear. Please ignore these platforms, these channels, this shop, if you come across it on Amazon. It has absolutely nothing to do with me. And if you buy anything from them, well, frankly, I think that you'll find that you're not going to get anything back in return because, as I said previously, I'm confident that this particular shop is fake and fraudulent. Anyway, there we are. With that, I'm going to now proceed to the program again, except to say again that I apologize to everybody that this is happening. As you'll understand, it's something over which it seems I have very little control. Let's return to the issues of this program, which, first of all, the world crisis, and it continues to have to center on Ukraine. And I make no apology for saying that, because the leaders of the global south are now collectively complaining about this. They're saying that the war in Ukraine has been made by the Western powers into the single most important event in current affairs, in international affairs. Everything supposedly must shape itself around this war. Countries are being asked, not by the Russians, not by the Chinese, not by the Indians, but by the Western powers. Countries are being asked to take sides by the Western powers, by the United States. They get threatened sometimes if they don't. And, well, the effects on these countries in the global south has been profound, with problems with food supply, problems with energy supply, food inflation spikes, all those sort of things. And they are bitterly complaining about the fact that, as I said, they're being asked to take sides in a quarrel that is not their quarrel. And the fact that the pressure to take sides overwhelmingly is coming from the West is making them less keen on the West and is making them more determined to opt out as quickly as they can from the world financial system, which is, of course, dominated not just by the West, but specifically by the United States. I don't know, I still don't fully get the sense that people in the West, in Washington in particular, have understood how exasperating the rest of the world finds the US and Western stance over this war. But because it has been conferred with such importance, I am obliged to come back to it. And here we have a fair amount of news coming through about events over the last 24 hours or so. And the first thing to say is that the Russians continue to make progress in Bakhmut. And I said a few days ago, I think it was the day before yesterday, that the Russians are 6 blocks from reaching the road that leads through Khromovo into Bakhmut. And yesterday, on Tuesday, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the Wagner organization had captured 3 blocks, so the pace of their advance is accelerating, perhaps connected with the heavy bomb attacks, the bomb strikes, the airstrikes that I was talking about in previous programs. And that might be accelerating the Russian advance. But anyway, we had yesterday these comments by Yan Gagin, who is Denis Pushilin's advisor. Denis Pushilin being, of course, the acting president of the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is what Gagin said, and he said it, as always, on Russian television. The Wagner private military company controls about 90% of Artyomovsk, in other words, Bakhmut, and its advance is inevitable. And he then complains bitterly that the Ukrainians are booby-trapping buildings and blowing up major infrastructure facilities before leaving the western outskirts of Bakhmut. And he says that the Ukrainian armed forces, these are quotes from him, these are his exact words as quoted by TASS, the Ukrainian armed forces are okay with using scorched earth tactics. This is what they did in Volnovakha and Mariupol, and now they're blowing up and booby-trapping major international infrastructure facilities in Artyomovsk before retreating from the western outskirts of the city. A local community centre was one of the buildings that they blew up recently. Well, that's what Gagin says. I mean, I have to say, when it comes to war and fighting and what goes on in war, it's perhaps unsurprising, at least to my mind, that buildings get destroyed and bombs, heavy bombs, dropping 500-kilo bombs on buildings, as has happened, is also going to lead to destruction. So when Gagin puts all the blame, as he appears to be doing, for the destruction in Bakhmut upon the Ukrainian military, well, I don't think we need to go that far or necessarily agree with him. But it is clear, it's very clear, at least to me, that the Russians nonetheless are continuing to make headway in Bakhmut. And I don't know how long this is going to take. It's step by step, one apartment block at a time. But nonetheless, as Gagin says, with the way things are developing at the moment, the overall capture of Bakhmut does look inevitable. Now, what I will say about this is that, of course, we still had rumours about a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut. There's been no sign of it at the moment. there's supposed to have been a meeting between President Zelensky and his top military people, in which Zelensky supposedly told his military people that he needs an attack right away in Bakhmut, in Zaporozhzhye, somewhere, in order to show that Ukraine is still fighting. I don't know whether these instructions were indeed given, but it is indeed the case that Zelensky himself has been visiting the war zone. And again, this is this time from his channel, from his own press service. They report that Zelensky visited the frontline positions, and we're told that he did so in Avdiivka. And most likely this is because Putin, as we know, visited the frontline positions of the Russian military. Has just been there. He's met all the top commanders, and he met them in Kherson region, General Mercouris. He met General Lapin in Lugansk region, and obviously Zelensky wants to be seen also visiting his commanders, visiting his troops. He can't just leave Putin to be doing this, and that's why we have this strange duel, if you like, between Putin and Zelensky, of the two, both of them visiting the command posts on the front lines, one after the other. On the topic of Putin's visit, I would say that Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that the military commanders in the south, in Kherson region, Mercouris and his team, and the ones in the north, Lapin and his team in Lugansk region, they had actually expected a personal visit by Putin. And this is how TASS reports it. He says the military command was not informed until the last minute that President Putin would personally show up to meetings of the Dnieper and East battle groups in the zone of the special military operation. According to Peskov, Putin's visit to the Kherson region and Lugansk People's Republic was not planned ahead of time. The commanders were called to a video conference meeting, and they were not aware that Putin would appear in person until the last moment. Peskov explained that the head of state visited the headquarters in person so that officers would not be taken away from commanding troops by travelling to Moscow. After the meeting, they returned at once to their immediate work on the ground. That's actually quite an interesting claim by Peskov, because we're told that these commanders were invited to attend a video conference with Putin, but that they were simultaneously intending to travel to Moscow for this video conference. Instead, Putin decided to visit them directly. And that's where Peskov explains that Putin didn't want to affect their time, didn't want them to be taken away from their task of commanding troops. And as a result, after the meetings were concluded, the commanders were able to go straight back to work without having to waste time on a long journey. That, as I said, doesn't make entire sense to me. If it was a video conference, why did the commanders have to travel to Moscow for it? Could it be that after the Pentagon Papers leaks, the Russians are a bit worried that the US might be listening into these video conferences? It's a possibility. Or could it be that there was another reason entirely, and that is that Putin is concerned about the situation. He wanted to go to the front lines to get a measure of the commanders and their troops at their actual command posts. That would make complete sense to me. Or perhaps there was some other reason which we don't fully know about and which hasn't been explained here. Perhaps, as I said, it was also intended to show to the troops themselves that the commander-in-chief, which is to say Putin, is visible, that he takes an interest in what they do, and that it was, to some extent, part of a morale-building exercise. But anyway, that's what Peskov said. I'm not going to probe it further. I don't think we can possibly say what is actually going on there. But anyway, that's what Peskov said. It was an impromptu visit. The commanders were taken by surprise. And in the meantime, we have heard news that Ukraine itself did try to launch some sort of attack overnight, during the night, in the Zaporozhzhye area. And we get this information from our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is one of the senior officials or political leaders in the Russian-dominated government of Zaporozhye, which controls most of Zaporozhye region, but not Zaporozhye city itself. And Rogov tells us that the Ukrainians made 2 attempts overnight to attack in Zaporozhye's Orekhov regions, Orekhov area. Orekhov is this town that the Russians approached in January. They don't seem to have made any serious attempts to capture it, but it's clearly a major concentration area of Ukrainian troops, presumably involved in this offensive in some way. And then this is what Rogov tells us. And he says, at first, on the Zaporozhye front, between Kamensky and Orekhov, a group of Ukrainian fighters, without the support of equipment, tried to conduct reconnaissance in force of our defense line in the zone of responsibility of the 291st Artillery Brigade. It was met with retaliatory fire, and the rest of the, he uses a certain name for them, but anyway, the Ukrainians returned to their positions. And then shortly after, in the second case, the enemy proceeded with equipment after artillery fire. The Ukrainian armoured group went further east than the first time. There it was met not only by the 291st Artillery Brigade, but also by special forces, reconnaissance and tanks. Now they're estimating their losses. It was dark at the time, and Rogov pointed out that it was the Ukrainian armed forces units formed in western Ukraine that took part in the fighting. Now the last, I take it to mean that these are the forces that Ukraine has been preparing for its offensive. Now, I suspect that these were reconnaissance acts of reconnaissance in force. Note that they were conducted at night. And that does make me wonder whether part of the plan, when the great Ukrainian spring offensive that we've been hearing so much about for so long, when the spring offensive is finally launched, whether perhaps the plan is that it will be launched at night in order to take the Russians by surprise. Now, for a very, very long time, since the 1970s, when thermal images first started to appear, the Western powers have claimed or believed that they have an advantage over the Russians in terms of night vision devices. And given that the Ukrainians need to push against a heavily fortified lines, it perhaps makes sense that the Ukrainians expect or hope that they will get more advantage in launching such an attack by launching these attacks against at night when the Russians perhaps might not see them. Well, I suspect that the Russians have greatly developed their night vision devices since then, and it's likely, or so it seems to me, that the Russians were fully aware of these Ukrainian movements pretty much from the first moment, and that was why the Russians were able to counter them, including with artillery and tanks, so quickly. So if this reconnaissance in force was intended to probe Russian response, the speed of Russian response in the event of a nighttime attack, well, the Ukrainians now know that in the event of such an attack, there will be severe problems. Anyway, the Russians have also been talking about the strength of their defenses, and we've had comments now from various Russian officials, and Sergei Aksyonov, who is the head of the Crimean government, has said that if the Ukrainians do launch an attack, specifically through, not Aksyonov, it was actually Vladimir Saldo, who is the acting head of the Russian-controlled Kherson region government. He says that if the Ukrainians try and launch an attack in Kherson region, they will suffer very heavy losses. He said they risk a major calamity. He says the fortifications are very solid, several layers deep. So even if anyone attempts to get through, it will be a disaster and more Ukrainian soldiers will die. They will simply be thrown into the slaughter. And he said that he doubted that Ukrainian troops would be able to reach Crimea in the event of a counteroffensive because of the strong fortification structures. Now, Rogov in Zaporozhzhye has been saying much the same. He is saying that, in fact, if Ukraine does launch an attack, it will be repelled. And he also says that the Russian forces in Zaporozhye are actually looking forward to the Ukrainian attack. He thinks that if this attack takes place, not only will it be repelled, but the Russians will be able to go onto the offensive, that they will be able to counterattack. So that's what Rogov thinks, that's what Saldo thinks, that a Ukrainian offensive has few prospects, very limited prospects of success. Well, we shall see. Now, I'm going to quickly say that we've also had comments about the Ukrainian offensive from the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Now, Ben Wallace is someone who, let's say, is never likely to talk up Russia's prospects or talk down Ukraine's prospects. He's been one of the most fervid supporters of Ukraine in this conflict in the West. And he spoke about the Ukrainian offensive in what I thought was rather, shall we say, less than fully confident terms. He said that the Ukrainian offensive, he was confident that Ukraine would maintain momentum, as he put it, which is an odd choice of words. He didn't seem to think that Ukraine would break through. He was clear that the war was most unlikely to end this year. In other words, that the Russians will remain in control of much of the territory that they control now by the end of the year, despite this Ukrainian offensive. And he also said that there was no magic wand to break Russia, and that, in fact, he seemed to clearly think that Russia's prospects of holding together, weathering this offensive, at least that was my impression, that the prospects of that were reasonably strong. So that was what Ben Wallace said. And again, one does rather wonder about what people really do believe about the prospects of this offensive. The Ukrainians are being pushed, as I said, by the Western powers into launching it. I wonder whether that is a good idea. I've said this many times, I wonder whether ultimately, deep down, the leaders of the West think it is such a good idea either. Whether there aren't doubts at various levels. And in a recent program we did on the Duran, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou pointed out that commentaries about the war in Ukraine from neocon websites and publications in the United States are getting increasingly shrill and increasingly grandiose in their thinking, already sort of talking up the prospect of Russia's total collapse. One wonders whether these publications, these articles that are appearing, aren't partly intended to still doubts, to silence people like Ben Wallace in advance of this offensive taking place. Now, I should say that I have seen a piece by a commentator at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is another one of these London-based think tanks that has fairly long history. Anyway, this person said that I can't remember his name. This person said that the prospects of Ukraine's offensive, its likelihood of success, would be decided in the first 24 hours. And he seemed to place very heavy reliance, I thought dangerously high reliance, on the offensive in this 24 hours, causing the Russian military leadership to lose control of the situation, and the Russian troops who are holding these heavy fortified lines to panic. In other words, and this takes me back to that program I recently did with Alex Christoforou. Alex Christoforou made precisely the same point, that this is all intended, all this talk about an offensive, this launching of this offensive, all of that is intended, more than anything else, to create, both within the Russian military and the Russian political system, a crisis of confidence, a sense that, things are going wrong, Ukraine is on the attack, the West is supporting Ukraine, the Ukrainians have all this wonderful, ultra-modern, ultra-sophisticated Western equipment, these sparkling tanks and drones and missiles and artillery pieces and such things, and that Ukraine's victory, because it's backed by the West, is in some way inevitable, and that hopefully is going to create a crisis. The Russian military will panic and break down, and the Russian military leadership will do the same, and perhaps turn against President Putin. Now, I have to say, I don't think there is any possibility of that at all, but there are some very bizarre stories circulating about General Gerasimov potentially leading a coup against Putin. There's even a Pentagon Papers piece, one of the leaks in the Pentagon Papers talks about Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, in league with Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Security Council, being in conflict with Putin on the eve of the war. There's been articles in the British media about Gerasimov leading some kind of a coup against Putin. Very strange stuff. And I do wonder, just wonder, whether some of this rumour mongering about the state of events amongst Russian military leaders might be working its way into some of the decision making that is going on in the West. And I wonder also whether Putin's visit to his generals, the generals on the front line, Lapin and Markarevich, weren't intended in advance of the offensive to make it absolutely clear to everybody in the Russian military commanders, Russian soldiers, that the military commanders on the spot have the situation under control, that they have the full backing of the president of the Russian Federation, Putin himself, and that the president and the military commanders, Putin and the generals, are as one in their determination to see this war fought through to victory. So I think that is probably the true explanation for this visit by Putin. He is aware, the Russians are becoming aware, that, as I said, this offensive that's coming is as much a psychological warfare operation as an actual military operation. I don't myself have any doubt that the Russian military is solid, and I doubt that they will be panicked or thrown off balance or anything of that kind. But just to make sure that nobody in Moscow, in Russia, and on the front lines has any doubts about that, that is why Putin went to the front and met the soldiers. Meanwhile, as the Western powers continue to remain obsessed with the conflict in Ukraine, the rest of the world carries on its business and makes its own decisions. Specifically, we now have the visit by the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, to Damascus, where he has had a meeting with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This has been a meeting which just a few years ago would have been considered almost inconceivable, well, entirely inconceivable, in fact. But now we have the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal, in Damascus, meeting President Assad, and the Saudi Foreign Ministry publishing a statement which says, amongst other things, that Prince Faisal's visit falls within the framework of the kingdom's keenness and interest to reach a political solution to the Syrian crisis that ends all its repercussions and preserves Syria's unity, security, stability, and Arab identity, and restores it to its Arab surroundings in a way that achieves the good of its people. And Syrian news agencies say that President Assad told Prince Faisal during their meeting that the Arab states should play a key role in supporting the Syrian people, liberating all Syrian territories, stabilizing the situation, and overcoming the consequences of the war on Syria. So, an important visit by Prince Faisal to Syria, a clear sign, if you wish, that, as I said, the world is moving on. But the United States is perhaps less interested in Prince Faisal's visit to Damascus, though it must be an event that some US officials are deeply shocked by all the same. But probably what infuriates them much more than this is the visit by another foreign minister to another country, specifically Sergei Lavrov, who has just been to Brazil. And he's visited Brasilia, and he's had meetings both with the Brazilian foreign minister, and they did held a press conference together, but he was also received, Foreign Minister Lavrov was also received by the President of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And the anger on the part of some people in the United States, as what they're starting to see as Lula's portrayal, is really very remarkable. There's been a whole succession of increasingly angry articles about Lula. There seems to have been a general assumption, as I've discussed in earlier programs, that Lula would follow unswervingly the US side on international issues. And of course, Lula has just been on a long visit to Beijing, where he met with Xi Jinping, has spent a long time with Xi Jinping, forged various economic agreements with Xi Jinping, with China, and reaffirmed Brazil's strong relationship, its strategic partnership with China. And over the course of Lavrov's visit to Brazil, Lavrov, following his meetings with President Lula and with the Brazilian foreign minister, agreed a joint press statement with the Brazilian government, which reads as follows. During the visit, which was marked by traditionally friendly atmosphere of the bilateral relations, Foreign Minister Lavrov was received by President of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He also met with Chief Advisor of the Presidency, Celso Amorim, and had talks with Foreign Minister of Brazil, Mauro Vieira. The Foreign Minister gave a lecture at Rio Branco Institute, Brazil's diplomatic academy. During the talks at the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, the parties gave a detailed analysis of joint efforts to strengthen the Russian-Brazilian strategic partnership and discussed the current state and prospects for the development of bilateral cooperation in the political, material, cultural, and humanitarian spheres. Special focus was placed on the key issues on the global and regional agendas, including bilateral cooperation and multilateral organizations, above all at the United Nations and its Security Council, BRICS, and G20. The parties reaffirmed their intention to continue the coordination between the foreign ministries of the two countries, in particular on aligning their approaches in the international arena. They set a tentative schedule of contacts at various levels for the forthcoming period. Now, notice that this statement between the Russians and the Brazilians refers to a Russian-Brazilian strategic partnership, just as Russia has a strategic partnership with China and a strategic partnership with India. It now has a strategic partnership, also it turns out, with Brazil. And in the concluding parts of this statement, we read that the parties, that is to say Russia and Brazil, will continue to continue the coordination between their foreign ministries. In other words, they will work together on foreign policy positions, just as the Russians and the Chinese do. Now, all of this shows the closeness of the ties that have developed between Russia and Brazil, which were not fully reversed by the Bolsonaro government, but which have been obviously reaffirmed with much greater energy following the return to power of President Lula. What I have to say puzzles me, again, is why people in the United States, the government of the United States, so many people in the media class, the political class in the United States, thought that it would be otherwise. Lula has a very long history of close relations, both with the Chinese and with the Russians. He was a founding member of the BRICS group. In fact, when the BRICS, the original trilateral arrangement of Russia, India, China, became the BRICS, it was very much on Lula's initiative. So given that this is so, this is a policy, this closeness to the Chinese and the Russians is a policy that is very much a signature policy of President Lula. It was a signature policy of Lula when he was president previously, and it is a signature policy of President Lula now. So why did people suppose that Lula would want to take a different line? I have no idea. Wishful thinking, perhaps. The idea that Lula could somehow be won over to the West, perhaps that he was compromised in some way. Who knows? But certainly there seems to be genuine anger in Washington that Lula has embraced the Russians in the way that he has done so soon after his visit to Beijing. And in addition, it seems that the Russians are intending to invite Lula to the next meeting of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, in other words, in Russia, that presumably will take place sometime later this year. Well, we'll see whether the invitation is made and whether Lula does indeed go. But if he does, I can say with confidence that that will not be well received in Washington. Anyway, Brazil is not the only place that Lavrov is visiting. Shortly after he visited Brazil, he travelled to Venezuela, where he's had equally warm meetings with President Maduro and other Venezuelan officials, and where, by the way, he's also had a meeting with the foreign minister of Bolivia. So all of these people coming to Caracas, well, Lavrov coming to Caracas, the foreign minister of Bolivia coming to Caracas to meet Lavrov there, as well as obviously speak with the Brazilians, with the Venezuelans. And of course, the Venezuelan government is also very keen, clearly, to maintain its relationship with the Russians. Now, a few months ago, there was a lot of discussion about Venezuela altering its policies, adjusting them, becoming more critical of Russia after the start of the Ukrainian conflict, of the Venezuelans listening to offers made to them by the United States. Well, as we see, all of that has not actually resulted in any fundamental shift in Venezuelan policy. The Venezuelans continue to see the Russians and the Chinese ultimately as their key allies. And again, I am surprised that some people in Washington apparently appear to be surprised by it. After all, it is the United States that has, in recent years, sought to overthrow President Maduro. It is the Russians and the Chinese who backed him. Why would the Venezuelans abandon their friends, the bidding of their enemies? It doesn't make any sense, and as we see, it's not what the Venezuelans have done. Anyway, Lavrov will then continue his journey, his Latin American trip. He's also going to visit Nicaragua and Cuba, two countries that are very friendly to Russia and which have taken the Russian side, but over the Ukrainian conflict. But it's clear that the main part of Lavrov's journey was his visit to Brazil and his visit to Venezuela. On the other side of the world, Secretary of State Blinken, who has not been able to rearrange his trip to China. The Chinese at the moment are refusing to receive him. And the Chinese are also refusing to speak to President Biden or to Secretary of Defense Austin. Anyway, Blinken, unable to go to China, has decided to go to Vietnam instead. And again, one gets the sense that the purpose of this visit is not so much to try to improve relations with Vietnam for their own sake, but rather to try to, again, win Vietnam over to the anti-Chinese bloc that the United States is trying to build in the Pacific. And about a year ago, Kamala Harris, the vice president, of whom we hear virtually nothing nowadays, by the way. But anyway, Kamala Harris also visited Vietnam. Her visit was widely seen as a disaster. It went hideously wrong. I can't see why Blinken is going to have any more success in changing the Vietnamese minds, making the Vietnamese change their policy so that instead of maintaining a kind of equidistance between China and the United States, backing the United States against China, I don't see why Blinken would be any more successful with that than Kamala Harris was. But nonetheless, I suppose Blinken does need to do something to keep himself occupied, so he's off to Vietnam. So here we see again the nature of the differences in approach to diplomacy. Note that in that press statement between the Russians and the Brazilians, which I've just read out, there's no reference to Ukraine, there's no references to the United States, there's no suggestions that the Russians and the Brazilians are taking together an anti-US position. They are forging, however, a strategic partnership. They are going to coordinate their foreign policy positions, but they're very careful to exclude from their press statements any criticism of the United States. Now, that's a sign of foreign policy sophistication, of diplomatic sophistication. The Russians and the Chinese have realized that it works contrary to their interests to try to force big countries like Brazil and Vietnam to take sides on geopolitical questions. The result is that foreign ministers like Lavrov, Wang Yi, and the rest can travel to countries around the world and they can be confident of a warm reception. The United States, by contrast, does the opposite. It goes to countries and it says you must take sides over Ukraine, over the issues in the Pacific. There's been this enormous outcry and criticism, it still continues, of President Macron's comments following his trip to China, in which Macron spoke in ways that some people in the United States felt went against US policy over Taiwan and the South China Sea and those sort of things. So it's not surprising that countries around the world prefer to deal with countries like China and Russia, especially China, obviously, much more powerful country, much wealthier country than Russia, major part now of the international trading system, that they prefer to deal with the Chinese and the Russians as opposed to the Americans. And Lula, for his part, must be bewildered by the criticism he's currently getting from the United States, because he wants to maintain good relations, historically good relations with Russia, historically good relations with China. He must be bewildered that the United States is so critical of him and has turned on him so radically, even as he goes out of his way to say that his good relations with the Chinese and the Russians are not in any way hostile, give no indication of hostility to the United States. The United States needs to rediscover diplomacy. It has lost the skill to conduct diplomacy in the way that its adversaries do. And we see what the result is. Most of the world outside the West is not as concerned about the conflict in Ukraine as the United States is. Now, that is a fact. It's maybe something that people in Washington are not happy about, but it is a fact which they need to take into account. Their refusal to do so is weakening US global influence and is losing the United States friends. Is the United States capable of learning from that? I have to say, I think the answer to that question is obvious. The answer is no. Well, that's me for the day. Again, a longish video. Thank you for joining me once more. Just to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And also don't forget to check out our shop. And if you've liked this video, press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.